Good morning. I'm Pastor Jane Gingrich, and I serve Hills of Peace Lutheran Church here in Kamloops, British Columbia.
I'm Pastor John Boyd, and I serve St. George's Anglican Parish here in Kamloops, British Columbia.
We are a clergy couple, and on a regular basis we have complicated conversations. But for these last 9 months, we have been recording them weekly and sharing them online in order to invite you into some of these conversations, as happens every Thursday morning. This week, our topic is what has become meaningful for you in worship these days. Sounds like a mouthful, but nonetheless, I think there have been some shifts and some changes for some folks through this time, and it's important to recognize that as we move ahead and look into the changes that are likely coming again, especially here in British Columbia, with the numbers increasing and conversations with the ministry coming up for faith leaders. And so, what has changed, or what have you seen that is creating meaning for folks in your community through this time of worship?
Well, I think that we've gone through no gathering at all during the first phase that we were all told nationally and provincially that we wouldn't be in person anymore for health and safety reasons. And that was a time of learning and trying to imagine how it was we were going to connect through our life of prayer. And the first stage consisted of being together in spirit and believing and knowing that we were together in spirit, because worship itself was either pre-recorded and preset, and there was a time in which we'd all watch together, or hopefully be watching at the same time, or we would watch the services that were live streamed by churches or parishes that had the capability to do that right off the bat, until, of course, we'd learned a little bit more about technology and how to make that possible for our own parish. And then there came a time where we could do things live on Facebook, so that everybody was able to watch at least at the same time and see. And then we were able to take it a step further with Zoom worship, and being present in each of us in our own location, being able to gather together in the same space at the same time and interact with each other as well. So there was a gradual development of being able to use the technology and the software and all of the venues that were available electronically, until we were able to meet again in person. But that took on a very different shape as well, of course, because of restrictions and safe distancing and different ways in which we were allowed to be together and still maintain health and safety standards. And the Eucharist became a rare thing rather than something that was offered every week as a sacrament. So, at least for me personally, the Eucharist has taken on a whole new added layer of meaning because it has been that less frequent. What about at Hills of Peace?
I think we've been through a number of changes as well. I had some experience with Zoom already from before we came into this time of global pandemic shutdown. And so we immediately moved on to that platform. And the form of worship that has been offered is what has seen the greatest transition over these months. And so initially there were prayers and offerings of teze, contemplative singing, where there's chanting for a number of hours, interspersed with other prayers offered. And after a few weeks of that, we were coming to Holy Week. After a few weeks of that, we were coming to Holy Week and wanting to be more festive in our approach to Easter, recognizing that the gifts from God still come and are offered to us. no matter what's happening in the world. And so from that time forward, moved into a more liturgical form again. And the length of the service moved forward, I suppose you could say. We went from a shorter length to a longer length through the season of Easter, and developed a service of the word form that we use on a weekly basis now at this time. Additionally, through the summer and now into the fall, there have been monthly gatherings in person, and on those Sundays the congregation is diverted to another community for the online service. And there have been a few opportunities where there's been collective working together to prepare worship among several congregations within our region. And so more creativity through this time, certainly. Most of what is available and accessible is online. Of course, there are mailings and deliveries that include devotions and abbreviated worship forms as well, in different months of the year as well. So I would say, as we have these continued experiences online, there has started to be some reflection within and among the congregation of what connects. And I hear a lot about prayer being a piece that has greater meaning for everyone through this time, because even despite being dispersed all over the city, and for some even in other communities who join in, we are united in our prayer together when we are praying, certainly the Lord's Prayer especially. But in a time of worship, the silence, the prayers, the petitions really draw people together. I've also heard variously so on our Zoom platform, you may choose to turn on or not your video. And of course, there are those who don't have video cameras. But as we are this evening, I understand that often people are more comfortable in what they are wearing when they are worshiping in these days. And how, for some, that has changed and made the worship more personal in some ways, because you worship in your pajamas. You are far more comfortable than you might be if you were putting on layers or clothing that has to look good or look a certain way, or what a person might choose to wear leaving their home. And so that too has an impact on an experience of worship, to have that more familiar kind of a practice of joining in at this time. Of course, I recognize that's not the only reason people don't turn on their video, but nonetheless, it is for some. Are there other experiences you've heard of in the community of St. George's?
I think for us, prayer is becoming huge. It's already been a very important focus of the congregation. The prayers of the people. We have a number of congregation members that write and actively participate in that ministry. We have, of course, a prayer chain of people that specifically are tasked with special petitions that come forward out of the community and for the community. But so much of the service of the Word is prayer itself, and listening to the ways in which God speaks to us and we respond to God, and how that language and entering into that space of spiritual reflection and being in dialogue with God changes our understanding of the world and changes who we are as well. So the importance of the Word itself, especially God's Word talking to us, has become quite significant. And along with a Bible study that we're doing on the Gospel according to St. John, I think the understanding of the Word and what it is, who it is, and what it does is also making that time of prayer for us that much more important as well. And quite frankly, I don't want to ignore the cause of necessity as well. If we cannot have the Eucharist and so many other elements of our worship that have been integral and part of what we do together, and we are more and more reliant on simply that dialogue between us and God and ourselves in prayer, you begin to go into it more in detail. You're spending more time with it and heavily focused on it, and that changes the way in which you think about it and the way in which you interact with it in your own life of prayer and your understanding of it as a Christian too. So I don't want to ignore that that has been beneficial in terms of our understanding and approach to worship. And I also think that the congregation has noticed a shift in that too as well. We talked about some of our Bible studies in the last year that looked at specific forms of Christian prayer line by line. And one of the things we talked about is, up to this point, there were many times that we'd simply recite the prayers because it was just where we were and part of what we were doing in that time in the service. And now I think there's much more awareness in terms of the language we're using and what we're saying and how we're saying it. So that has been, I think, a wonderful part of growing in faith through all of this. So
Definitely that sense of being more mindfully present in what's happening in worship. And I think that can happen more or less when we're in a home context joining in online. We almost have to pause and take an extra minute to let go of everything else and not care that there's toys all over the floor, or ignore that the dog is barking at something at the window, or not worry because our coffee's cooling over there, or maybe just quickly go grab it so you don't have to worry about it.
Right.
But there are at least as many distractions, if not more, when we're in our homes for a time of worship than there are when we are able to gather in person on site in our buildings at churches. And so I think that's really true. That sense of joining in mindfully or being very present to what's happening has to be that much more intentional from these different settings. Yeah. So thinking about all the distractions that there are at home and the ways in which we engage in worship nonetheless through Zoom, in some cases Facebook Live, in others when there's a recorded service. I do wonder, and this is a conversation piece for those joining in on Thursday certainly, if there aren't times that the readings or some aspect of worship is more of a distraction, or because it doesn't have the same connection for some individuals, makes it that much more difficult to remain in that time of worship. We are so limited when we are together on site that on the Sundays that we are able to gather, I limit the readings. The sermon is really more of a brief homily reflection. There isn't the opportunity to sing. Things are very pared down on those Sundays that we do gather on site. But online, we continue to have that liturgical form of including word and psalm and gospel and message, very similarly to what we have been used to for generations. And now that we have moved to being online so much, to having so much that's on a screen, I do wonder at times if a person doesn't find that their mind wanders a little bit more, or, I mean, if you're watching a recording, you just fast forward through that part.
Yeah.
But whether there are aspects of our worship that need some more time for reflection, not that they need to change necessarily, but maybe there are some adaptations or adjustments for the format and the setting in which we find ourselves. I know you reflect regularly on what is important about the liturgy and how we are together in that gathering space, regardless of whether it's physically or not. Are there things you've imagined or thought about for worship with your community that way?
Yeah, there is one part, and I don't want to sound ungrateful, of course, we're grateful for what we have. But there is a very frustrating aspect, at least for me, but I think it's also frustrating for others, is the transmission time lag in worship, which makes the call and response and the dialogical part of worship extremely difficult. It is very hard to say, the doxology together, for example, and that can be extremely distracting when there's the lag and you're off. And just basic considerations. One of the interesting things is that because we're all being projected into a shared common electronic environment from our own individual environments, if there is background noise or if somebody forgets to mute themselves, it can be incredibly distracting, because there are more so even greater everyday background noises and things like that, which would normally get shut out in the architecture of the worship space in a controlled environment, where it makes it possible to meditate and to focus. Now you're literally welcoming all of the outside sounds into the worship space. And that raises a really interesting theological debate, of course, between liturgical renewal and the idea, those people that subscribe to an idea of a development of doctrine or progress or evolution in the church, is that, well, perhaps we should have more outside involvement and natural back and forth between the worshiping assembly and the outside world, so that that barrier is more permeable. And I think there's something to be said for having that discussion and that discernment. I also think that there are key aspects of the liturgy which do need that intentional silence. I would say definitely there are moments in the celebration of the Eucharist which should have a controlled environment and not necessarily a bunch of distracting noise or things going on in the background as well. What about for your experience of worship in these different ways that we've been doing them?
I can agree with what you're saying, and I think for my own participation in meetings and whatnot through this time, you don't notice the refrigerator running. You don't always think about the kettle boiling. You start to miss the other white noise that's in the background of what's happening in your own space, because we tune it out. Perhaps that's shifted and I'm more conscious of some of those things now, but certainly early on as well, when I was leading or filming or participating in a meeting, I wouldn't catch on to those noises. Now the dog barks, child makes a noise, door slams, mute happens quite quickly. But I think you're right. There's an interesting piece at play there between thinking about what it means to be bringing all that we are into worship. And part of that in these days is all that's around us within our spaces as well. And also at the same time finding space to have the focus be God, and not taking away from that and drawing back to ourselves and what's distracting around us. I immediately start thinking of all kinds of other ways of drawing on neighbors and community, and what does that look like to draw everyone together into a space of communal worship, and how that's a beautiful image, perhaps slightly impractical in some ways, and at the same time so difficult, and one wouldn't want to be assuming, knowing that we have neighbors of great diversity right here in the neighborhood around the church in our home. And so then I think of other ways that while we are participating online, what that has opened up for us, that now is when we do gather, we're not able to participate in it. Singing, for example. We love our music. We love to sing. We love to be engaged in music. You're right. That lag does not allow for much in the way of responses. We tend to keep those who are providing responses within the same space so that the lag isn't a factor. And those who are participating are often fully muted for the length of the service. However, singing And music making is still a part of what we offer on Zoom, and yet we cannot have participants join in song when we're together on site. And so there's an opportunity now where we can't sing in person when we're online. There is the opportunity to have the music and the voice and those who are at home also singing and joining right in with gusto and glee as they are able and interested to do, recognizing that there is this common voice that we are sharing in together despite circumstances. Well, we've meandered a little bit all over the place in terms of talking about worship. Is there anything else that you would like to add, thinking about what it means to be making meaning of worship in these times?
Just that I'm looking forward to our discussion on Thursday and hearing what it's been like for other people. Because I think that's the other important thing, is especially in this time to continue to have dialogues around what we're experiencing and to listen to each other and see if there are things that need to shift or if there are things that are working very well.
Agreed. Thank you. Thank you for listening. Do join us on Thursday from 10 a.m. until 11 a.m. The link for the Zoom conversation is on the Hills of Peace Facebook page and websites, or has come to you by email. See you then.